Good evening, namaste and hello everyone. Today I'm at Queen's Mary University in central London and I'm with Dr Prakash Shah, who is a reader at law at this Queen's Mary University. And today I'm here to ask Dr Shah a few questions about this caste legislation that we've been discussing within the communities. I've got a few sets of questions for you, Dr Shah. I hope you will give us as direct answer as possible. Let's start with very simple questions. What is this caste legislation?
Right. First of all, namaskar to you as well and to the entirety of your Nepali community. Yeah. Very proud to be interacting with them on this very important issue of law, which is going to affect mainly the South Asian communities settled in the United Kingdom, and including very prominently the Nepali community. So, about your question regarding the legislation, the legislation is basically currently a duty upon the government to implement caste as part of the racial discrimination under the Equality Act. And so the Equality Act 2010, which is when the caste provision was first inserted, has over a period of time changed. In 2013 there was an amendment to direct the government or to impose a duty upon the government to implement that clause. So what will happen is that people can be sued under the Equality Act for incidents of caste discrimination.
So, sorry to interrupt there. So what you're saying is that caste discrimination is now almost the same as racial discrimination?
Yes, actually, because the legislation very specifically says that there is a duty to make caste discrimination an aspect of racial discrimination. Right? So it becomes one face of. So for example, if you have the mountain Kailas, yeah, and you say, which is the face of Kailas? You can see one face or second face, so it will be like a face of this particular object which is said to be racial discrimination. So caste will be one face of it.
Right, okay. And why do you think this was brought in? Why do you think there was a need for this legislation?
Yes. Well, actually the need has, in the view of myself and people that I'm cooperating with to oppose the legislation, we feel that the need was actually created, if you like, or it's been manufactured. We have to bear in mind...
Did you say manufactured?
Manufactured, yes. It's an artificial need which has been created. And to get to to get a hint of how that has happened or why that has happened, we don't have to go much further than recognize the fact that it was a former Anglican bishop who sits in the House of Lords and who has been relentless in his allegation that the Indian, Nepali and generally South Asian communities are, if you like, incorrigible discriminators on caste grounds. Right? So that's the allegation which was made and used to substantiate the need for the legislation.
So, I mean, was it just from this evangelical bishop sitting in the Lords, or we had our Hindu pujari or priest as well raising this issue?
Well, actually, if you look at the interaction with the Indian communities, yeah, there has been hardly any interaction. Before the legislation came onto the statute book, there were some consultations. During those consultations, informal consultations with civil servants, representatives of the Hindu community were informed that there was no evidence of caste discrimination and that there was no real prospect of caste coming onto the statute books. Right. But in 2010, by surprise, actually it wasn't just Lord Harris, it was a number of people, particularly on the Liberal Democrat benches, but also supported by the Labour Party very strongly, who collaborated to introduce this piece of legislation and to reinforce it in 2013, to make it a duty upon the government to implement.
So, were there any credible evidence that the government or the parliament had to bring in this legislation?
Actually, there have been some reports. Right? Reports which are commissioned by the government. There is one report which is written by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Yeah. There have been two reports written by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Our position is that none of them adopt an adequate methodology. They don't represent the issue of caste discrimination in a fair way. And the so-called evidence that they collect is merely a series of allegations. And actually, once you go through them, you realize that they would not even, most of them actually wouldn't even have any chance of being litigated under the legislation, because it's due to things like temples or marriage decisions, right? Which are completely outside the law. Nobody has the right to interfere in who you marry and so on.
So basically what you're saying to me is, based on mere allegations, they have come up with this legislation.
Yes. This is the position of myself and people I'm working with, particularly as part of the Anti-Caste Legislation Committee. Right? So we've been strongly representing that there is actually no evidentiary case. The current consultation on the caste discrimination law by the government concedes that that evidence is not present, and it also concedes that they don't even know how to define caste. We don't even have an acceptable definition of caste. Right? So it begs the question, what are we actually going to make the law on? What are the courts going to interpret? Right? The very object of the legislation seems to be unclear.
Wow. I mean, has there been any court cases regarding this? You know, because I'm particularly interested in, you know, like I come from Nepalese community,
Yes.
you know, we do have, you know, Hindus and Buddhists, and within that as well, you know, we do have different caste. We live cordially in the community here. So has there been any court cases?
There has been one leading court case, and in fact, although the duty in the legislation to implement caste as an aspect of race has not been done, the courts have gone ahead, they've sped ahead and said, actually caste is already included as part of ethnicity, which is already there in the legislation. So we think that, first of all, that case was a setup. It's very interesting that it was a Christian woman who was suing her Buddhist employers. Right?
So Christian woman,
yes,
suing her Buddhist employer.
And remarkably, the issue of caste only came on the scene at a very late stage in the initial litigation. Right? But it was that point, after the initial employment tribunal accepted that caste could be read into ethnicity as part of the Equality Act, that point was appealed. The Equality and Human Rights Commission supported that interpretation. Right? So in a sense, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, knowing that there was opposition, particularly among the Hindu and Sikh communities, went for a robust interpretation of legislation to include caste. Right? And also knowing that the actual duty in the legislation had not yet been implemented. Right? So they really confused the issue by supporting this case. And the Employment Appeal Tribunal actually said, they agreed with the Employment Tribunal and said, yes, actually, caste can be part of ethnicity. So today, you have a situation where somebody can actually be sued. The legislation has not been implemented, but there is a case which allows cases of caste discrimination already to be brought in the courts. Right? And what we've been arguing that is a very dangerous precedent. Why? Because it involves an interpretation of the word ethnicity, which is a part of race. Now, anywhere in law where you have the word race, you can say that caste is present. So even in the criminal law, you will know that there are also criminal offences to do with racially aggravated offences. There is racial and religious hatred legislation. Those are elements of criminal law, not part of the Equality Act. But tomorrow a judge can say, this is a caste-based offence, right? Because they can read caste into the provision on race. Right? So potentially, and without anybody debating this or without anybody being aware of this, the scope of that case law is potentially massive.
Okay, let me just get a bit more clarification on this, this employee who is from Christian background, who sued a Buddhist employer. So did this person who sued the employer specifically sue this employer on racial ground?
Okay, there were some
caste ground?
Yes, so there were some other issues in the case, like underpayment of wages and so on, right? So those are all questionable issues as well, but we don't need to get into those issues right now. But it's remarkable that the caste was raised at a later point. Nobody asked the lady who was complaining what her caste background is. Nobody asked the employers what their caste background is. And yet the courts thought it fit to make a finding of caste discrimination in the case. How comes? You know? And if you look at the evidence, the case becomes even more ridiculous, because the kind of evidence they have presented to substantiate caste discrimination is that the claimant says, well, I was wearing a white sari with a red border, and that clearly indicates my caste background. Now, anybody who comes from India or Nepal or whatever would instantly realize that that's a ridiculous claim to make. Right?
Yes.
But this was the kind of evidence that led the courts to make a finding of caste discrimination. How comes? You know. So from the word go, we are deeply suspicious that the whole case was a setup. Right? And it also begs the question about what is the capacity of the legal system to do justice in cases which involve caste discrimination allegations? Will they be able to do that? What will happen in future cases?
Yeah.
You know, so this is an issue of tremendous concern. Now, in that case, the Turkey case, the employers lost their house.
They lost their house?
Yes, the costs of the litigation, if you look at the official legal aid figures, the costs of the litigation run into over £300,000, right? So the potential implications on made-up charges of caste discrimination, you can see for yourself.
And what about the employer? Did he or she didn't have employer's liability insurance to cover the legal costs?
As far as we know, there was no.
Probably the provision doesn't exist at the moment.
Yeah, no. You see, if you have a domestic servant,
yeah,
right? How many employers would actually be conscious enough to obtain insurance on the basis that they're employing a domestic servant? Most people would not think about that kind of thing.
I don't think this caste discrimination is covered by the because this is something new to them as well.
Well, no, it will now be, and that means that particularly if you're a South Asian background, which means one of the primary groups which are likely to attract charges of caste discrimination, insurers will raise insurance costs.
So premium will rocket
Premiums
upwards.
could potentially, and if you are sued, what will happen? Your business, or as an employer, or as an organization, your community will be told you have to settle the case, because it's more than likely that a court will find against you.
Yeah.
Because everybody thinks that Nepalese and Indian people discriminate on grounds of caste, so you're going to find it very difficult to challenge the case. Just settle, right? Which means, number one, you don't get a chance to vindicate yourself, to prove yourself right. Secondly, you still might have to do a payout, because settlement doesn't come for free. Right?
No,
it could come. So you may not be guilty, but you might still be paying out money.
Okay. With this legislation, in our community, in South Asian community, and definitely in our community as well, we've got various communities like Tamudi, mainly that means Gurung community.
Yes.
We got like a Pasapucha, like Newar community. We got Chetri community. We got Brahmin community. How this legislation will impact this community when they conduct their activities, social activities, and so on? Yes. How will it impact them?
You see, if one takes the Christian interpretation of caste, right, which is actually informed the dominant way in which the social sciences think about caste as well, and we think the way in which the law will also construe caste.
Yeah.
Anything that these traditional communities do is said to be a manifestation of false religion. Right. If they're doing it as a matter of their tradition, it's actually an aspect of Brahmanical false religion, right? Even if they are not from a Brahmin group, it will be said that they are following Brahmanical rituals or traditions which inherently cause them to discriminate on grounds of caste. Even belonging to a jati will be said to be an inherently discriminatory kind of institution, right? So any activities they might do, maybe they're organizing Navratri events or weddings or something like that, could prima facie come to judged as an instance of caste discrimination. Right? So the potential implications are massive, right? And there's no indication that anybody is thinking about how to limit the scope of this legislation, if it's ever been implemented. Now that we have the case law already, there's no limit on the case law either, right? So you could be done for organizing any kind of event where it is simply alleged that there is a caste element, and that will be read to be a inherently discriminatory activity. So most of our traditions, your Nepali traditions and so on, could likely be under attack.
Okay, good example. Basically, let's say I take example of Pasapucha. I mean, they are from Newar community. Every year they've got their own kind of puja day, their holy day, and mostly the people from that community do that special kind of worship and this and that. So what you're saying to me now is that could be under attack as well, or there are some risk.
I mean, imagine that you have an association which is constituted just around your jati group.
Yeah.
Right? Now, somebody can say, well, the terms of your membership are discriminating on grounds of caste, aren't they? Right? Next thing you know,
let's say I'm a Brahmin.
Yeah.
So I have an association.
Any group. Guru,
anybody.
Yeah.
For example, so let's say if someone from let's say different group wants to become a member of the our group,
Yes.
which we happily accept anyway, but for the sake of example here, we cannot deny.
Yes.
If we were to deny, then we could be sued under this.
It would be said to be an instance of caste discrimination. You see, many of these bodies, if you look at the Jati-based organizations, I mean, there are so many Indian communities which are also organized like that. They are providing a lot of valuable services to their communities, right? But they will be start to be told, particularly if they are charities, that they are no longer entitled to charity status because they are violating the equality law.
Really?
Right. So part of your funding base goes.
Okay.
Right? So your ability to continue to provide the level of services that you're doing will reduce commensurately. So you can maybe operate informally, but you will be prevented from operating on any formal ground because you'll be said to be violating the equality law.
Yeah. So what's the implication to businesses? I know we touched upon that earlier. What's the direct implication to business owners from, let's say, my community, the Nepalese community, and wider, Hindu, Buddhist?
Yes. I mean, let's say South Asian broadly.
Yes.
Earlier I said that prima facie the South Asian communities will be the most suspect communities, if you like, because they are said that it's obvious to everybody that they discriminate on grounds of caste. If it's so obvious, it means you're a primary target. Now, as an employer or as a business, you will have to ensure that you know the caste background of all the people that you're dealing with. Now, the legislation doesn't, most people have said we don't require any kind of monitoring on caste basis, right? So you won't be required to monitor. But in fact, if you don't know who you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, right? In other words, you don't know the caste background of your customers, your employees, etc., you could inadvertently offend them, right? Next thing you know, you have a case against them. So to protect yourself, you have to know the caste background of people so that you ensure.
So basically, okay, I just want to get clear here.
Sure.
I have a restaurant.
Sure.
Okay, I've got about 10, 12 people working, and I've got mostly people from Nepal, and I've got a few Indian colleagues as well.
Yeah.
So what you're saying to me is, I need to know each of their caste.
It will be sensible for you as an employee to know that. So the official story is that you are not required to monitor.
Okay.
Right? But so what you are doing, you're bringing caste to the foreground, right? It's as if, as an employer of South Asian or Nepali background, right, you're being forced, you're being put into a position where you have to make sure that you know the caste. If there is a problem, then you can say, look, I already took steps, right, to protect yourself, right? Legally protect yourself. Because if you don't, you're more exposed.
Okay. That begs me a question. I mean, there aren't any really live issues of this caste discrimination in the UK. I mean, not many community members felt that's the need that legislation was required in the UK. Then why?
Well, you see, this is where you get into the wider agenda, which is being played out here, right? So part of the rationale for the legislation is that it should extend to all communities, regardless of religion. Right? Now, that plays back into United Nations discussions, which are being had right now, to do with India and why India should be obliged to extend its caste-based reservation.
Nepal as well.
Nepal potentially as well.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, Nepal as well. Could equally be applicable in that case. That the need to extend caste-based reservations to Christians. Right? So this is the long game that is being played out. Now, of course, if you associate the extension of caste-based discrimination to reservations to Christians, you are also saying that, well, okay, there is no other barrier to full-scale proselytization and conversion from hereinafter. Right? So, because one of the things that the Indian state has, in a way, managed to ensure is that by keeping caste-based reservations limited to certain communities, they've limited the possibility to convert out of your traditions, if you like. But once that barrier is no longer there, there will be potential for mass-scale conversions. And at the moment it happens, but it's kept secret so that people don't lose their caste-based reservations or other benefits, right?
Right.
But in future it will be much more open.
So, is it fair to think that the end goal of this whole thing leads to some kind of someone's aim to convert?
Look at
our community.
I'll just give a hint of what's going on. There is an organization called the International Dalit Solidarity Framework Network. International Dalit Solidarity Network. IDSN.
Yeah.
Right? Now that organization is primarily funded by Christian organizations, churches. It operates out of Copenhagen. A branch of it is the Dalit Solidarity Network in Britain, which is so completely behind the caste legislation here. Now, that organization is also seeking United Nations consultative status, right? Which means that it will have a privileged access to lobby on all kinds of caste issues, right? Now, why does such an organization want to be the representative of people who are claiming caste discrimination issues? Right? What is the link between religion, i.e. Christianity, and that potential for campaigning? Yeah. Why would they want that? And I've been quite explicit on Twitter and other fora. I've said that the Indian and Nepali governments should firmly oppose the granting of consultative status to such organizations, right? Because they see. So what it also tells us is that the UK is being used as a proxy ground.
So basically, what you're saying is this Dalit solidarity is being funded by Christian missionaries, yes, or Christian churches, yes, and even a layman would know why they would fund Dalit, let's say, or any groups.
Well, it's not hard to guess, yes.
It is not hard
yes,
to guess.
Even
yes.
for the layman.
So that means, I think, after talking to you, Dr. Shah, it's quite clear that it is going to negatively impact our community, and there's nothing positive about it. Question is, how do we stop it?
Okay, I mean, there are a variety of methods. One of the things, of course, is to align any community organization with the Anti-Caste Legislation Committee.
Yeah.
And so enable us to make representations as a united body made up of a huge number of community-based organizations to the government, mm-hmm, to object to, fundamentally object to the premises of the legislation as well as the case law, right? Because that's a very important point. You see, there are some Indian community-based organizations, even Hindu organizations, who've basically accepted the government line that the case law should be accepted. We resist that, right? So the Anti-Caste Legislation Committee has a very distinctive message, right? We should accept neither the legislation or the case law. Right? That's very, very important for people to be aware, and people should not be fooled by this fig leaf of the case law, right? Because it's not going to be of any help to our community. Actually, it's going to create more problems,
right?
As I tried to say.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Shah. I think it was great help, really, to understand what's happening here. So what we will do from our side is we'll just go to our community as well. We'll put it through the wider audience and let them digest this information that you've given to me today. And hopefully that, this will bring more awareness to the communities, and hopefully, we can come out strongly in one voice to resist this legislation, which for which there's no need at all, and we know now why it was brought in. So, yes, yes. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And namaste.
Thank you.